Hi, Carson. This is your first name, right?
Yep. Yep.
The most interesting question is, what was your first computer?
What was my first computer? I The first computer I remember as a computer was an Apple II GS,
Hmm.
which was the old. It was the Apple II series, and it was kind of their last one. And it had some pretty. It was better than the Mac at the time. I think it was color, and it had like a really cool paint program and stuff like that. That's what I remember. Although I know we had stuff earlier than that, but that was I didn't really think of it as a computer at the time. Um, and The first programming language that I used was HyperTalk, which was the
Ah,
programming language for HyperCard, which was an old development environment on the Mac. And
but it was
so
revolutionary, right? I
it
mean, this
was
is hyper. Yeah.
Yeah, it was. It was hypermedia, which we'll probably talk about a fair bit in this discussion. It was hypermedia, but local. There was no network without plugins or something like that. And so, but you had hyperlinks and stuff like that, and you also had a scripting language. That scripting language was called HyperTalk, and
Mhm.
I've actually created a programming language called HyperScript that is based on
Okay.
HyperTalk at some level.
Okay.
So we could talk,
Hmm.
maybe talk about that near the end.
And you started just programming right away, or gaming, or what was your no?
I was never very good at games. That was actually a superpower of mine. Was I was just always terrible at video games. I was good at Mario Kart and Street Fighter, but that was about it. And so I had a lot more time than my friends to program because I just couldn't play games at their level. Like GoldenEye is when I tapped out. I was like, this is just too much for me. Um, but I started program. I mean, I programmed, in as much as it is programming with HyperCard, and then I went to college thinking I'd be a computer programmer because I was pretty good at it compared to my friends. And I went to Berkeley for undergrad, and I found out just what an actual good programmer is pretty quickly there, and figured out I wasn't necessarily on that level. So I ended up kind of tumbling around a little bit at Berkeley, but eventually ended up getting a master's degree in computer science. And the programming language that I ended up working in the most early on was Java. So I sort of
Hmm.
grew up. I grew up with Java. I grew up with the object oriented, the excitement around object oriented programming, kind of in the late '90s and early 2000s. And so that's where I came out of. Um,
But why you started programming at all with the hypercard, and why hypercard?
It was just there, and I could do neat stuff with it. I could put, I put together some simple little mini apps for people. It really blurs the line between, it's kind of like small talk in the sense that the
Hmm.
development environment is also the evaluation environment. So it's all kind of one thing, and so you set everything up the way you want it, and then you just say, okay, here you go. And so I just had, I had neighbors that I think I got paid a little bit every once in a while for building little basically contact apps and stuff like that. But I just liked it. I like messing around with it. It's fun to make stuff work. And So, I don't know. Just I enjoy. I'm glad I've ended up programming. There were a lot of different directions my life could have gone, and I just ended up sticking with programming, and so it's good.
Okay. Well, what is your next language? So straight Java, or what was between hypercard and Java?
I did a little bit of basic,
Okay.
especially Visual Basic for applications (VBA), and I programmed in that because my first job was with a consulting company, and they built these big spreadsheet models. And so VBA, I mean, it doesn't have the best reputation, but there's a lot about it that I really liked. Especially it shared with HyperCard this idea of you could double click on a button and see the code that was associated with the button, which is a really fantastic development experience. And so I ended up writing a lot of code, and I could program, which was unusual in the consulting company I was at, and so I ended up writing a huge amount of code in very elaborate models for I think for pharmaceutical companies, unfortunately, but so that's what I did right out of college. But
Okay.
I had learned Java in college a little bit, and that was where the excitement was in '99 and 2000. And so I tried to, and I pretty quickly pivoted to a job where I could work in Java a lot more. And that was back during the old like J2E 1. Like EJB 1.0 world. So I
Hmm.
ended up pivoting into that. I'm working in that world for about a decade.
So you started with the HyperTalk, and then you studied basically, and then you learned Java, and after the study, you became consultant and did a little bit of VBA work, right?
Yep, yep.
Okay.
Yeah, just kind of a.
So you did a lot of stuff with J2E or EJBs or not?
I did a little bit with it. I
Okay.
with 1.0. By the time, so I went to grad school, and then when I graduated from grad school, I got a job at a Java shop. But they kind of had their own thing that they had built, and so they had their own database layer and their own web layer and all that sort of stuff. And so I didn't during the, I would say the meat of my Java career. I didn't work with J2E because I worked on a platform team that was building sort of
Okay.
a separate version of it, a little bit different take on it.
And was it nice?
Yeah, I worked on a programming language it's called Gosu now. It was called GScript at the time, which is, you probably remember early on in the J2E, or not early on, but like right around 2007, 2008, there was just this explosion of programming language for the JVM,
Of course.
right? So you had Clojure come along. Kotlin was just starting to get going. Scala was there. Groovy, JRuby was really big for a while. So Gosu was a smaller player in that constellation of programming languages.
How it's called? I never heard.
It's called Gosu.
Gosu.
Gosu,
Interesting. I forgot
yeah.
about
If you
that.
go to gosulang.github.io, you can see a very old and unupdated
Okay.
thing on it. And it was another scripting language for the JVM. We ended up compiling it down to bytecode, which I think may have actually ended up being probably not worth it, just because of just for reasons I can go into later. But it was good for me because I teach at a university here in Montana, and I teach compilers, and so I can we target the JVM for our compiler. Because I just have experience with that. And so it's kind of nice to have the students actually building a scripting language that produces bytecode. So, but it was,
So you are teaching. So you are teaching at the university right
yeah,
now.
I teach at Montana State up here in
Okay.
Montana. So, but it was a really good experience. I mean, it was nice. It wasn't the best probably for my resume, but the fact we were basically building our own version of J2E gave me a lot of pretty low level experience with
Yeah.
database code.
Hmm.
And, we kind of built like 2 or 3 different web frameworks. And some of the ideas that ended up in HTMX kind of came out of that work. So,
Ah. Everyone built back then, their own frameworks,
yeah.
and you had to build a web framework at least. So this was a must.
Yep.
And database layer, I would say at least you build something, like abstract data access object
Yep.
pattern. Then with a factory and generic factory, there was a lot of discussion whether it should be, the real factory or abstract factory.
Yep.
And then, of course, lots of value objects, which were named, which wrongly actually were data transfer object. Remember?
Yep.
Back then,
Yeah.
discussion value object versus data transfer
Yep.
object.
DTOs.
And yeah, exactly. And the huge discussion whether we should decouple the
Yeah.
layers. This was the more layers you had on the slides, the better
Yep.
it was. So interesting. So you are actually a hardcore Java developer.
Yeah, I feel like I know the language pretty well. I haven't been able to program in it professionally. I just started. So what happened after, this is just, I'm giving you my biography here, but after I was working at that company that was pretty hardcore Java stuff, I ended up starting a company, and we started it. It was started in like 2012. And in 2012, if you were creating a startup, you did it in Rails, in Ruby on Rails. That was just what everyone did. And so we did it. And so I spent about a decade working in the Ruby community. And I have to admit, I never felt super at home there. It's a very dynamic and funky language, and there's some neat stuff you can do with it. It does have good Clojure support and stuff like that, so that's nice. But I just never really was a Ruby person. I spent a decade doing it. I know Ruby pretty well now. But I always felt like I was kind of a fish out of water. I always preferred Java, um, and C sharp, like programming languages like this are a little more structured, but not as structured as some of the more formal functional languages, which just always, I
Mhm.
just didn't think that way. So I grew up, again, during the object oriented hype, and I still just think that way. Like, I just tend to think in terms of objects. I know people I run into a lot of people online who don't like that, and they think it ends up leading to spaghetti code. And I do think there is a tendency to over-architect things in the Java community and in most of the object-oriented
Yeah.
world. But on the other hand, I really like just thinking in terms of objects. Bruce Eckel wrote, was it Thinking in Java?
Yeah. Thinking in
Yeah,
Java, and yeah.
and that's where I come from as far as like just my mindset and how I tend to think about abstracting problems and so forth.
Yeah. Interestingly, so I spent lots of time in, I would say, Jakarta right now in micro
Yep.
profile, but in interesting environment like serverless and Fargate
Mm.
and environments
Yeah.
like these. And there are not lots of objects actually.
Yeah.
So what happens right now in Java? We have dependency injection, but actually no interfaces. The classes are simple. Inheritance is rare
Yep.
actually. So, but it's very productive. So the code looks almost like beginner code in
Yep.
1995 if we just write simple Java
Yeah.
classes. But it's a good
Yeah.
thing because Java records, for instance, a simplified thing. So you can be very pragmatic with Java
Yeah.
right now. And the interesting part is everyone understands the code because there's no magic,
Yep.
right? So I mean, it is really hard to write magic code in Java. So you can write a simple code which everyone understands, and the performance is just great. So we actually outperform all the scripting languages, which is really good in the clouds because you can save time. If you save
Yep.
time, you save money. So this is why there's lots to do in the last a few years with Java in the
Yeah.
clouds. But interesting. So this is Bruce Eccles in the how the book Domain Driven Design by who? I think it was Mr. Evans,
Mm.
right? And this book was about not only object orientation rather than domain driven design. And this is harder. It's not always needed in database driven
Yep.
applications, or data driven applications. So this is a difference. If you are working in an insurance company and you have lots of polymorphic
Mm-hmm.
behavior, this is something different. But what I see is that people are often overthinking the enterprise
Yep.
architecture, and you have lots of stuff which has nothing to do with the
Yep.
business. This is my observation in Java.
Yeah, I
Mhm.
agree with that. I think that that's a problem that you have. It just Java, and I really think J2E. I mean, I can talk about. There's lots of, as much as I like Java, there's a lot of stuff that they, I think, did wrong. And I want to preface everything that I'm about to say with the fact that Java and the people who worked on Java got an incredible amount of things correct. Like I teach
Mhm.
C, like I help students learn how to program in C. And if you know C, like the Java string class, the Java like linked list and array list class, the map, like the fact that any object in a JVM can be a key in a hash map was just absolutely brilliant. That's a brilliant idea, and yes, it's a pain to get right sometimes, but it's just such a brilliant idea. So they got a huge amount of stuff absolutely right. On the other hand, and
Mhm.
that's again as preface to this. On the other hand, I feel like they missed on a couple of APIs. So IO is finally better now than it used to be for simple stuff. Um, but
Yeah.
they over applied patterns. The IO library is a classic example in Java. They just, for whatever,
Decorator,
they
right?
just got a hold of the decorator pattern, and that was what they were going to do. And the decorator pattern makes sense in complicated situations where you really have to dynamically build up what you're doing. But it sure is a pain in the rear end to deal with if you just want to read a file as a string.
Hmm.
And so,
Yeah.
I think, I have to say, I think they made a little bit of a mistake with the Streams API too, and that they put a bunch of really useful functional transform methods kind of over on this other thing, when where you really want them for the most part is in collections. And so these, and I just, there's like all these little things that, you go to the Ruby people or the JavaScript people or whatever, and they look at it and they're like, what is a stream? I just want to map this array to something else. Why am I doing all this crazy stuff? And so I think Java, and that coupled with the J2EE, I would say mistake of 1.0, where they really were like, we're going to take object-oriented programming and we're going to put it on the network. EJBs are these object-oriented things, and they're going to live on the net, and it's going to be completely abstracted away where they live. And there's going to be, you remember all these roles they were going to have, like they were going to be your bean administrators and all this stuff.
Assembler, deployer.
Exactly. And it just was like, this is never going to work. And it was super complicated. And I feel like Java has had the Java community has had a tough time kicking that. I think microservices are probably helping with that. I also think that there are some sort of libraries, some smaller libraries like Javelin jumps out at me. If you've ever seen Javelin, the web framework, as a very focused, simple piece of infrastructure for doing web apps. All it does is web routing, and that's it. Job Runner, if you've seen Job Runner, that's
no, but Javelin is older, right?
Javelin's not that. I mean, it's. I think it's in 4.0, so it's been around for a little bit. But it's just more focused.
Yeah, I think it's like 2000 or something.
Has it been around that long?
It was,
I don't think so, because there was Spark Java, which I think Javelin was a kind of a fork of, or a rewrite of, but I don't remember the exact details. But
Javelin. Okay, this is Javelin. This is a Kotlin based. But this was also, it was like Javelin was also a persistence framework. Okay. I think I know. But this is
this is a newer one. And I see flickers of hope from that perspective, that there's, because I am a Java developer at the end of the day, and I'd like to work in Java a bunch. I'm actually working on I consult now, and I work for a client who has a Play One app. I don't know if you remember the old Play One.
Play was the huge revolution, that you could have Scala routes, and you can have, RESTful interfaces, and everything was supposed to be type safe.
Well, that's two. That's Play 2. Play 1 was the original version of Play, and Play 1 was basically like Java on Rails. It was a straight copy of Ruby on Rails for Java. And they did a really good job with it. There's some stuff in there that's a little janky, but they did a good job with it. But it's been discontinued, and so I'm working on it for a company that's still limping along on it right now.
But this is really old. It's like more than 10 years, right?
Yeah, it's very old, but it works, and they do keep updating it. With security releases and so forth. So,
but the first Rails clone was actually Grails, right?
Grails,
Grails?
Yep.
Groovy. Mm-hmm. It interests me because you have a Ruby experience. So around 2010, I got lots of questions. Why I'm doing Java? Because Java will die. Rails will win. Yep. And then it became very suddenly almost forgotten language, right? So I mean, Ruby right now is this almost, I rarely see it in projects. So I would say 10 years ago, I saw Ruby everywhere. Everyone tried to do something with Ruby. And now it disappeared. Why? I mean, why back then everyone talked about Ruby, how great it is, and now it just disappeared?
Yeah, well, I think a couple things. Number one, I think the Ruby language is actually pretty weak as far as a general purpose language. I think it's a very creative language. It's a very flexible, and you can do metadata programming very easily in it. There's some very interesting stuff in it, but it's just weird. It's just a weird programming language. And especially when JavaScript took off, and I mean, this has been there's been this weird, like, JavaScript took off, and I think JavaScript is what killed Rails, because all the people who were the hipsters who were super excited about Ruby got super excited about Node and JavaScript. And JavaScript has a lot of the same open, creative, kind of loosey-goosey infrastructure available that Ruby had. And so why would you bother with this somewhat strange programming language. There was CoffeeScript in there too. I don't know if you remember CoffeeScript.
Yeah, CoffeeScript. This was like the attempt to make JavaScript a little bit more like Ruby, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so I just think it was just a little too weird and a little too out there. And so I think as soon as JavaScript became a viable server side framework, the people, the people in San Francisco and the Bay Area kind of just, you could
Yeah.
see it. They just went the JavaScript direction, and then that was it for Ruby and Rails.
But the
Still,
argument over and over again, Rails and Ruby was back then, the aesthetics and the beauty of the language. So this is what I remember. Was and always arguments how beautiful it is and the DSLs and whatever you can do. And I never found time actually to learn it really. So
yeah,
now I save
yeah,
some time. But I still have
yeah,
small old books laying around, about Rails or whatever, and
yeah.
I wanted to read them, but never found time actually to do that.
Yeah, I think Rails is really well done. There's some aspects
Hmm.
of it that are really very well done. And Ruby's not, I mean, I don't want to be too negative on it.
No, no.
Um, it's just, and I do think you could, particularly, earlier on, you did have the ability to make DSLs in a way that supports something like coroutines, which makes it possible to kind of build these control structure like things that make a lot of sense, but it's not that much better at the end of the day. And JavaScript has JSON baked in, and so you can just kind of you can half do whatever you want in that, and then it's
Hmm.
ubiquitous. And so I just think that sucked all the air out of that
Okay.
world. And then you also ran into a lot of scaling problems with Rails. Like at the end of the day, it's a VM written by like a couple people, a guy in Japan, and
Yeah.
just so I just don't think it had the institutional support. I don't know
Mats
if
was
you,
his name, right?
yeah,
Mats.
Mats. He's
Mats.
still
Mats.
around.
Hmm.
Mats. He's still around, and a
Hmm.
wonderful person. But again, I don't want to be too negative on Ruby. Anyone who likes Ruby, it's all good.
No, I'm just curious because back then, really,
Yeah,
it was like Java is dead and Rails is like everywhere,
yeah,
and the
yeah,
constant question to know why we are still doing Java. I'm so okay
yeah,
because this is what I know, and there's lots of requests, and then it disappeared. I was just curious why, right?
yeah,
Because yeah,
yeah.
now
If I
now
had
now we
to,
clarified that. Hmm.
yeah, I have to get. I think it's just it was a little too weird of a programming language. So,
Okay,
and then JavaScript, those two things together kind of ended up crushing
what
it. But
happened
now,
then?
and then JavaScript. This is the interesting thing: is that JavaScript actually peaked. Like a lot of people don't realize this, but JavaScript peaked probably around 2015. And the total number of GitHub projects that are done in JavaScript has been trending down,
Hmm.
and Python is really what has kind of blown up
Hmm.
lately. And so Python now, I'm sad to report, as a Java developer, is actually a more popular programming language than Java. Java never really lost the seat to JavaScript. I don't think it did, anyways. But JavaScript has gone down, and I believe it goes Python, Java, JavaScript now as far as
Hmm.
popularity of programming languages. And so that I think that was unexpected. But Python has really caught this wave of. First of all, here in the United States, Python is often the first programming language that is taught, and so
Okay.
you have a huge number of undergraduates who are using it. And then Python has a few sort of Rails equivalents. The biggest ones probably that I'm aware of is Django, which is
Hmm.
kind of this very old school web framework written in Python. And
Are you actually aware of the YouTube video? It was like how was it? Snakes versus something. This was like DHH versus the
mm,
Django committee.
mm,
So there was like
yeah,
shootout Rails versus Django. This was I
yeah,
remember that. I watched this. I
okay,
was just it was like because Django was like a CMS was
hmm,
built for I think cities.
newspapers, yeah,
Newspapers. Exactly. There was the history of Django, so which was, and he also know the creator of Django also explained why the name, and it turned out that it was like a guitar player, right? So the Django, yeah, were interesting
yeah.
stories. You have to watch it. Maybe you will find it on YouTube. It's like a
You,
Django versus Rails.
yeah, I'll go check that out. I'd be interested to see. They have very different flavors, and
Hmm.
HTMX, which we'll get to eventually. HTMX competes with to an extent, to a library that 37 signals and DHH
Stimulus.
created. Yeah, with stimulus. Well, I would say HyperScript competes with
Okay.
stimulus, but just Turbo in
Hmm.
general, Turbo
Okay.
Dev, Turbo Links, and then just I think they just call it Turbo now. Is it kind of competes, or it does something similar to what HTMX does. And what's interesting about that, and then what is interesting about contrasting Rails and Django, is that in both cases you can see a pretty drastic philosophical difference between me and DHH's approach, or 37 signals, which is informed by his design sensibilities. And then also with Rails, you can see the difference between Rails and Django. In Django, you have to do stuff, like everything's explicit and you have to do stuff. Whereas in Rails, there's a lot of magic. So you just kind of add something here and then boom, it all just sort of
Convention over
works.
configuration, right?
Exactly. And so it's interesting to me, and just to bring it full circle, the HTMX has been picked up by the Django community.
How you started
And
HTML? How HTMX happened?
how did HTMX happen? Okay, HTMX, how did it happen? Well, the genesis of HTMX, it was originally called Intercooler.js, and the year was 2012 or 2013. It was about a decade ago. And I was building a web app, and I was
Hmm.
trying to sort a table. I was just trying to get a table to sort, and I was doing it in JavaScript because all the cool kids in 2013 were sorting in JavaScript, and it took forever. It just was like it would grind my machine to a halt, and I couldn't make it perform. And I'm a pretty good programmer. I know most of the tricks, and I just I couldn't make it work. And almost out of desperation, I just
So you
said,
sorted the DOM elements, or what do you sorted?
yeah, I was
Okay.
sorting rows. So I was doing a
Okay.
comparison of rows and flipping them around, and I probably was doing it wrong. I'm sure there was like some undocumented hack, but I had gone through most of the stuff. I was doing quick sort,
And in
and
2012, you didn't use jQuery back then?
I was using jQuery. I was using jQuery. I was using
Okay.
jQuery. But for whatever reason, the table was too big. Just was too
Okay.
big. And so
Oh,
browsers,
what I remember right now, we had a problem with Internet Explorer.
yeah,
So if the table was too big, just the rendering of the table took like 1 minute. So
yeah,
we were in project where just loading the table was
yep,
really slow, and we thought our backend is slow. We thought and then we just like, look, we just store everything as plain HTML, so no interaction with the backend, and
yeah,
it took on the how it's called Internet Explorer, yeah, not Edge,
yeah,
Internet Explorer. And it took, I think, 60 seconds until it rendered. And Chrome was
yep,
fine. Chrome was also making it faster. Firefox a little bit slower, and the
yep,
Internet Explorer was that slow back then. So
yeah. Yeah, so I was. That's what I'm sure. That's what I was running into. So almost out of desperation, I ended up just jQuery. So I was doing a lot of jQuery work in 2012, and so what I did is I just said, okay, I'm just going to do this on the server side. And there
mhm.
was this jQuery.fetch or jQuery. I forget what get. I don't remember what it was, but it was a way to just like basically issue a request and stick it into the DOM.
Mhm.
And so I used that, and it actually ended up performing well. And so it let me achieve this ability to sort a table. I was doing it server side, but it ended up being faster than the the JavaScript VM that was available at the time on the client side. And
I think it's a fetch.
yeah,
I think it was fetch because
yeah,
we have fetch right now, in the
yeah,
standard,
yeah,
and this was like a trick you could show that you can replace with the standard jQuery. So this was the trick back then.
yeah. I'll look really quick. jQuery, is it fetch or like, I want to say
Dollar
get.
dot something.
Yeah, I don't remember. It was dot get. Yeah, it was
Get.
dot get.
Okay.
Was that it? Ah, boy, I don't remember. There was a way, anyways. So
Hmm.
basically, what I decided to do, and so I was like, oh, this is cool, and so I started using that trick in other places. I was like, instead of I started just pulling down like, oh, this is cool. I'll pull down a form and I'll jam a form into the page, but I won't build the form in HTML or in JavaScript. I'll just render it because I was using Rails, and Rails had really nice form libraries and all that stuff. And so I'll just render it over there and then slam it into the DOM. And it ended up that I created enough functionality because I added, oh, I need this, I need that, okay, whatever. And it just ended up coming to a point where I was like, you know what, this is a library. I'm going to release this as a library. And so I bundled it up. I called it Intercooler.js, which was a take on TurboLinks. So TurboLinks was kind of popular in the Ruby community, and that was a way to basically boost navigation speed, but it wasn't a full-fledged library. So with Intercooler and then HTMX, which is really Intercooler 2.0, I was really trying to make things more explicit. Like, okay, I want this button to issue a post to that URL, and then take the content and put it in this element in the DOM. Take the result, the response in HTML form, and put that into this part of the DOM. And
this reminds me of JSF.
Yeah, a little bit.
Early attempts for Ajax, because this was the same. You can say, if you change this, or if you issue this event, this area will change. Back then, JSF 2, I think.
A lot of ideas percolating around there. What I eventually came to, and HTMX, I think the name change reflects this fact. What I eventually came to realize is that what I was trying to do, the direction I was trying to come from, was I wanted to improve HTML as a hypermedia. So I wanted to stay as close as possible conceptually to HTML. And that's where, like JSF, for example, was this big server-side abstraction, right? And so you have to have like a JSF server to understand how to make that work. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted instead to say, okay, let's look at HTML. HTML is kind of a universal language. The browser understands it. Any backend can produce it. Any backend can handle HTTP requests. And so let's focus in on HTML and try to expand what you can do with HTML as a hypermedia, as hypertext. And so, I like to say we're trying to remove some of the constraints that have been placed on HTML. So, for example, in HTML, there's only two elements that can issue requests: links and forms, right? That's all you got. And they can really only issue network requests on clicks in the case of links, or submit in the case of a form. And that's pretty much it. And they can only issue gets and posts. This is super annoying. I can't believe the HTML spec hasn't fixed this yet, but you can't have forms that issue puts, if you're following standard HTML. And then finally, the final key in this puzzle, in my opinion, of unlocking HTML as a hypermedia is that the original hypermedia model, you had to replace the entire page. And so you had this big chunk where all this new content had to come down, even if all you were really interested in doing was like maybe updating one little small part of your UI with, for example, a form if you wanted to edit something or whatever. And so Intercooler and then HTMX aim to address that. They aimed
How popular was Intercooler back then?
Intercooler was pretty popular. I think it was at around 4,000 GitHub stars, so I'd call that a mid-sized. It was definitely an alternative, a little bit of a niche product, but we had a lot of people using it.
And the your competitor, or the Turbo, how it's called, TurboLinks?
TurboLinks, yeah, TurboLinks.
TurboLinks, okay.
Yeah, TurboLinks, I gotta think, has more people, just because it was baked into Rails. It was like the default. I haven't looked at what does turbo.dev have going now these days? I think it's turbo.dev. Is that right? No.
I'm on GitHub, TurboLinks. They have 13,000 stars right now.
Yeah, there you go.
Last release was 2018.
Yeah, Turbo, Hotwire dev. What's Hotwire at right now? Let's go. I don't know. I hate to compare.
Exactly. And TurboLinks is no longer under active development.
Yeah, so Hotwire Turbo, if you go to github.com/hotwired/turbo, is at about 37,000 stars. And that, I think, as you pointed out, Rails is kind of faded. And so I think that's hurting Turbo
Mm-hmm.
compared to Turbo Links. So the Turbo Links is sort of their older version of this. So, um,
Mm-hmm.
and right now, I'll just go look real quick, but I think HTMX, we're closing in on 7,000 stars.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're at 6.6 thousand, so 660 some odd thousand stars. And
Mm-hmm.
so HTMX has gotten, I mean, that's to me, if you get to 10,000 stars on GitHub, that's a significant project.
Yeah, sure.
And I hope, my hope is that we can get there, probably next year at some point, maybe the year after. But I'm trying to,
After this
again,
podcast, I mean, after this
after
podcast
this,
is released,
yeah,
you get it the next week, you know. So,
yeah, all the listeners, go to, if you want to. I don't get paid for this, so if HTMX is interesting to you, I definitely. It always makes me feel better to see people starring the repository. Um,
yeah.
but
So
that
they
was the
should
idea.
start first, you know, you start the repository first and then look at it. So this is the
Yeah,
deal here,
start
right?
first, ask questions later.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
but that was where it was both intercooler and HTMX were coming from this. Like let's use JavaScript because that's what's available, but let's use it to improve HTML. That's what I came to
Mm-hmm.
understand. At first, I was just trying to make stuff work, but over time, I started to realize, what makes HTMX different, and what makes there's other libraries like this. So Unpoly is a great one as well. Turbo Dev is very good. Hotwire, I should say, Dev is very good as well. What makes all of them different is that they tend to they focus on HTML as a hypermedia. So that's what they're not trying to replace the hypermedia model where you're exchanging hypermedia with a server. That's why the Hotwire people say HTML on the wire. That's
Mm-hmm.
I think Hotwire is short for that, where you're exchanging hypermedia with a server rather than exchanging JSON with a server.
Mm-hmm.
And so HTMX is definitely in that group, relatively small, but gaining some popularity, I think, at this point of libraries that's really focused on that. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's sort of where that was the genesis and how it came to be. And I would say over time, I've come to understand much better, particularly in the last 4 years or so, that I understand what hypermedia is in a way that I didn't when I earlier on in development. I mean, I always kind of, you know what a link is, you know what a form is, of all the, HTTP, whatever. But really understanding how it's distinct from RPC style architectures, which is what a lot of JavaScript web apps, like heavy JavaScript web apps that are using, something like
Mm-hmm.
React or something like that, they're actually more like old 1980s thick client apps. They're using data APIs. They're not using a hypermedia API. And there are advantages and disadvantages to that. And so, I think I've developed a much better understanding of what the distinction between those two models are and why, the advantages of one versus the other, particularly in the last few years. So.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting because I took a look at your HTMX framework or framework
Mm-hmm.
library.
Yeah.
And for me, it was very similar to the stimulus, from 37
Mm.
signals. So I didn't know
Yep.
about, the others.
Yep.
And I find it's interesting idea. But what's actually your thoughts on custom elements?
Custom
You,
elements.
yeah,
I don't have a strong feeling about them. Like components.
yeah, web components. Because if I look at your code, so I like actually, I'm using, if I'm doing something with JavaScript, what I'm doing, I'm using ES6, web components, and lit HTML.
Yep.
So there's, and sometimes Redux, a complete different approach.
Yep.
Maybe similar even.
Yeah.
Um, so how it works in my case? So I'm using um, in the backend I have REST with microprofile Jakarta, so JAX REST basically.
Yep.
And in the front end, how this works is I have a structure which is pre UML. So I don't know whether you remember. In
Mm-hmm.
UML, we have the boundary control entity, the
Mm-hmm.
icons, boundary
Yep.
control entity.
Yep.
And from Ivor Jacobson, I think. The boundary is the custom element. The control just consumes the events and talks to the
Mm-hmm.
backend.
Yep.
Then asynchronously, always asynchronously. Then it uses fetch, standard fetch, and then the request comes back, and updates to Redux. And then all components get notified and they get refreshed. But because we use lit HTML, it is fast enough. So for my projects, it's not,
Sure.
super fast. You cannot write, game with it. But, in general, no problems at all. And this is lean. We have no external dependencies except lit HTML. And your approach is somehow similar.
Yeah.
So you are working with data attributes. Seems like a little bit more. So this is your hook, right? And this is very similar to Stimulus, or from my perspective, is similar to Stimulus. And so, what are your thoughts on my approach? I mean, the different approach. So, what's the
I would say it sounds like it's more of a data API approach, right? Like you're exchanging an event occurs, it triggers some internal logic. You exchange a JSON payload with the backend server. You get some JSON back that updates a backing model, and then that's reactively reflected in the UI.
Exactly.
And that's I would call that the standard thing. Now it sounds like you have a very specialized setup for your app that sounds pretty lean, but that's mod a lot of complexity. That's how React apps for the most part work, or how Vue apps work, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's fine. I'm not gonna say that that's a bad way of building things, because it's obviously been very effective for many people.
Because we have the backends, right? So if I have a REST with JSON and I've already have the API, you will need a kind of middleware, Otherwise, what you will do.
Yeah, exactly. So, and let's table the API discussion for just a second, because what I do want to say, however, is that depending on your UX needs,
maybe one discourse very, very briefly. What are your thoughts on Angular?
On Angular, I didn't use it enough to have any strong thoughts. It seemed too complicated to me, and so that's a big reason why I built.
It is only popular in German enterprise projects. This is my feeling.
Okay.
Because I think in US you don't know you know any project using Angular right now in US?
No. I mean,
exactly.
I think it had that Google oomph behind it, and so that helped. But I React is very dominant in the United States.
This is also my opinion, because sometimes clients ask me about Angular, and I actually recently I rejected a project because I said I don't think it has a future. And React is reasonable. I mean, what I explain you right now is actually a clone of React, right? It's exactly what React does, but I'm using web components. The problem is, of course, with React Fiber, it's far more efficient than my approach with lit HTML, but it's good enough, and I don't need any external dependency, which is always good.
Yeah.
But this Angular in Germany and Europe is very popular in huge enterprise projects.
Yeah.
And I try now to tell them, no one uses actually. So web developers, it's not like they're using Angular. And they say, no, it's not true. It's very popular. And I just wanted to hear, from US, what the ecosystem there. It's also my opinion that React is actually hugely popular. Yeah. And Angular slows a little bit down, right? So this is my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's what you see here. You do see like when I see Angular, it is typically on large enterprise applications that have been started maybe like 6 or 7 years ago, and they're like, okay, we have Angular, we got to stick with it, but our developers, if you look at job postings in the United States, it's not even close. React just completely dominates everything.
Yeah. What's interests me, another question, regarding React.
Yeah.
In one point of time, the standard becomes so powerful that Facebook could get the idea that they don't need React anymore, right?
Potentially.
You mean this realistic? I mean, because what you are doing and the lit HTML, it is very, very similar to React.
Yeah.
So the question is, if Facebook says, okay, now we don't need React anymore, then it becomes interesting, right?
Yeah, I feel like they've got enough invested in it. There's enough tech cred that I can't see them abandoning React. Okay. I could see them open sourcing it and doing something like the Mozilla Foundation. At this point, React is just so baked into so much web development that.
You remember Google Web Toolkit?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, this was a similar story, right?
I
Everyone said,
know.
okay, did yeah.
Yeah, I remember. I remember Gwit. Gwit was a terrible idea. Holy smokes, that was a bad
Yeah,
idea.
I didn't like it. And in Germany, it was a huge hysteria. It was great,
I
but in
know.
the hosted mode, it was very slow. It was a magic on steroids, I would say, right?
Yeah, and just yeah, exactly like what is going on? No one, you
Yeah, exactly.
can't figure anything out. It's fine though. Whatever. Google's made some pretty silly
Okay,
moves in my opinion.
sorry. Now
No.
back to your HTMX. This was just I just wanted to know to hear you. What's your opinion on that? But yeah.
Yeah. Well, so as far as the contrast between the two, hold on, I'm trying to save some memory here. As far
Why
as
you have trouble with memory? You're
I
running
don't
on
know.
Raspberry Pi here, or what?
I know I'm on a new MacBook, and I think I've just been, I don't know, maybe too full. I'm just quitting everything. I can't tell what's taking
You
up.
have to shut down HTMX. It consumes too much memory, you know.
HTMX is 12K. It can't be.
Yeah, but you are not using the data API. This is
It
why you
can't.
have to pull all the stuff from the
Yeah,
server.
I know. It can't be HTMX. I refuse to believe it. But anyways, so the difference between what you're doing, so pulling data down, exchanging JSON with a server, and having a model in the client side that's updated, and then having the UI reactively reflect changes to that model. Again, I think that's the standard model that a lot of web
Okay.
developers are
Yeah, it
used
is.
to.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way most people build web apps. The distinction between that and something like HTMX is HTMX is exchanging hypermedia. So it sends up an HTTP request saying, I want HTML back. And that HTML, when it comes back, is then rendered into the DOM directly without going through any sort of transformation. Typically, there's hooks for doing stuff, but typically, and when you do it that way, you're actually staying in the original hypermedia model of the web, and so you get something called HATEOAS, which your listeners may have heard and probably, like most people, have kind of ignored or just been confused about. But what that stands for is hypermedia as the engine of application state. That's what that acronym stands for. And what that acronym is trying to express is the fact that when you get back a packet of HTML and you insert it into the DOM, all the events and all the things that HTML can do were encoded in that response. And so the endpoints can be very flexible. So, for example, if you're working with, this is just a classic example I give. If you're working with an endpoint for a bank account, just for a bank account, and you're working with it in JSON, and you get back a response, and it says, okay, account number 123, whatever, and then it says status overdrawn, right? So you get back that data from the server. Well, now your user interface needs to understand what that status flag means, right? You need to say, okay, status is overdrawn, so I need to hide this, I need to show this, I need to make this available, whatever. If you contrast that with an HTML response, if you get back an HTML response on an overdrawn account, it includes in it the buttons that are available on an overdrawn account. So embedded in the message is the fact that, oh, you can only make a deposit. You can't make any more withdrawals. You don't have to do anything as far as flipping state around in the user interface. Instead, all of that information is encoded in the state of the response that you get back. And so that's what is meant by hypertext or hypermedia as the engine of application state. You don't have side channel knowledge of a model on the back end. Instead, you just have a browser that knows how to render HTML, and that's it. And whatever the representation, however it changes, is streamed in hypermedia form to the client. So great. That's great.
Let me summarize that. So what I'm doing like, remote method invocation or Corba from 1990. So basically, right? So I have an maybe a little bit, not a remote procedure call, but a nice object-oriented RMI.
Yep.
This is what I'm doing.
Yep.
And what you are doing is self-describing or self-descriptive API, because what you get back, it's complete. So what you get back, it has all the links. So it is stateless because
Yep.
all the state transitions are already encoded in the representation. So you can
Yep.
just click and yeah.
Yeah.
So this is how web should be. So
Yeah.
your approach is this how HTML was meant to be, right?
Right. Exactly. It is. It's
And
a
my
good.
approach is building fat clients. So this is the difference.
Yeah.
No,
It's
no
different.
kidding.
Yeah. I think.
Fat client.
Yeah.
Is there no difference between my approach and an applet back then, right?
Yep.
So
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Exactly. And
and
so.
and and your actually, and your approach is the ultra thin client from Sun back then.
Yeah.
Their vision they had, that
Yep.
the client is just terminal, nothing
Yep.
there,
Yep.
and it can render this is now the difference. So you are a thin client and I'm a fat client. So this is
Yeah.
the architectural difference. And I do HATEOS a little bit.
Yep.
How is it
Hey,
actually pronounced? Is it
I have.
HATEOS?
I have no idea. Hate.
Because hate is a little bit
I
negative.
know.
So yeah,
It's a
yeah,
terrible acronym, regardless of how you pronounce
yeah,
it. I've always said
and
HATEOS. That's the way I've
and
pronounced it. It's probably wrong.
but we are usually doing this with JSON. The problem with JSON you get is really hard to describe the actions.
Yep.
Because if you return, let's say customers, right, and you would like to paginate, so at the end of the request, you can say the next thing is like the next 10, but the next 10 is different concept than the customer. You know what I mean? So
Yep.
the customer is a customer, and the next 10 is a action which has nothing to do with the actual concept. In your case, it's more consistent because what you are returning is just the presentation of the entire thing. So
Yep.
okay, now I got the difference. The Okay, nice. So
Yeah.
I hope
So,
I understood what you're doing.
yeah, yeah, no, I think that's a good explanation. That's exactly right. And it's just this idea, and this is what made the web so powerful. So one thing, so what are obviously there are disadvantages to this approach. Like it's not as interactive as a fact client. It just can't be. You're exchanging hypermedia with a server, and Roy Fielding, who wrote his
Yeah,
dissertation,
exactly.
is where the terms REST and HATEOS and all this stuff came out
Hmm.
of. He said that in hypermedia systems, the web is designed as what he called a coarse grain hypermedia system, where you exchange relatively large pieces of hypermedia back and forth. And so, HTMX the hypermedia model isn't going to work great in every situation. So if you have a lot of state flying around in your app and highly dependent user elements, for example, like something like a spreadsheet where if you change one value, like 15 other values might change, that's not something you want to put a server request in between. And so that's not going to work well. But, the closer you are to a more, I would call it more standard web app, where you are exchanging with the server relatively frequently, the better this model works. And there are advantages to it. So what are the advantages? Number one, you have the fact that it's a relatively simple model. It's a relatively simple model. You don't have a lot of client code. You have server-side code, but we've already got that server-side code. Now you have to render templates on the server, so that adds some logic there, but it removes a huge amount of front-end infrastructure that's necessary. So you don't have to have a routing layer. You don't have to have a front-end model. You let the browser and hypermedia be all of that for you. And
But you
so,
could do this with custom elements as
yeah,
well. So without
absolutely.
my approach, but this would be actually great because what I don't like if there is too much invention. So if there are
Yeah,
standard, I always try to pick the standard,
sure.
and but you are using data attributes. It's not as bad, but
Yeah,
yeah, because the data attributes are actually standard, right? So
yeah,
this is
yeah,
a standardized way, to express additional attributes, and the
sure.
custom elements is similar to this. This is the standard extension to express tags. So
Yep.
I would say similar approaches, right?
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah, and anything that HTML supports, HTMX just out of the box
Yeah.
should support. So as long as we try and support, for example, HTML5 validations. That's baked into
Hmm.
HTMX, so you can use
Hmm.
HTML5 validations. So
Form validation, you mean,
yeah,
right?
form validations
Hmm.
exactly. So yeah, I'm trying as much as possible to stay within the standards of HTML and really try and extend HTML as a hypermedium.
But
Another,
have you tried the custom elements, or it was not on the radar? Or
yeah, I've seen them. There's another project I'm working on that's using a couple, but I haven't gotten deeply into them. Um,
okay,
but let me just a couple of other advantages I want to enumerate. Another advantage to the hypermedia approach is that you don't have to worry about versioning your API as much. Because the messages are self-describing, once a user has entered your system, all of the endpoints are coming back and embedded in HTML. And all the actions and things they can do are embedded in HTML. And so you don't have this situation where you have to constantly be versioning your API as you might with a data API, because you can remove endpoints, you can do whatever you want to, and the hypermedia will just be updated to reflect that new state. And that's one reason why the web was so flexible, and why the web survived so well as a distributed network architecture, was because of this because of this flexibility. Like, as long as I can get into a website, I can navigate around and I can make use of it in a way that's not true of pure data APIs, which, obviously versioning data APIs is a big deal. You got to get it all right, backwards
yeah,
compatibility and all this sort of stuff. So that's another big advantage of the hypermedia approach. And then the third major one that I would point out, particularly for Java developers, is if you adopt hypermedia as your front end technology, you can actually do a lot more work in Java in your back end stack, because now HTML, which you have to produce anyways, you're either going to produce it, in JavaScript on the front end somewhere, or you're going to be producing it on the back end. Well, if you move that to the back end, you can use your favorite templating library in Java, and you can write a lot more logic in Java. So you have HTML plus Java rather than HTML plus JavaScript and a big whole mess of JavaScript and then a Java backend. So you can
yeah.
kind of cut out that big ball of JavaScript right here and end up doing a lot more work in your preferred language, presumably, of Java. And this is one reason why I think htmx is very popular in the Django community, is that they're very passionate about Python. They don't want to write a ton of JavaScript and have Python kind of reduced to just being a JSON basically a JSON terminal. And so I think that's one reason why they've embraced HTMX so dramatically, is that it lets them stay there. And one of my goals of coming on this podcast is to, tell Java developers, hey, you don't have to write a ton of JavaScript if you don't want it. You can actually probably spend a lot of time in Java.
One and a half more advantages. One advantage what I see also in your case is authorization.
Oh yeah.
Because what you can do, depending on the user role, if there's a way to transfer it to a server, what you could do, you could render or not render specific links, right?
Yep.
So an admin can have more menus.
Yep.
Because if in my approach, if that kind of approach, you have to do it twice.
Mm-hmm.
So what you have to do is you are not displaying stuff which is not allowed for a specific role, but you still have to validate on the backend, because someone could hack the server and just attempt it. In your particular case, you're doing it once in the backend, and then you are displaying whatever necessary.
Yep.
Another thing which I like is there's a lots of talks right now, server-side rendering, which we did for years in Java, with Node.js or whatever, component hydration or dehydrations, and this is what you are doing anyway. So I would say, kind of GSPs are back, and what I did for fun a few years ago, I combined JSPs with web components. And on my YouTube channel, so I would actually find it and put it. It's like a 3-4 years old screencast.
Yeah. Okay.
And why I did it? Because in some projects we had a problem. Just imagine a basic web component. Let's say with zip codes, right, in the US. Yeah, and this is actually a static thing which happens on the server. And what we did, we had a JSP which creates on the fly the static elements for our web components, because otherwise we would like to render the component first, then call back the server, fetch the JSON, and render it on the client. So it was a lot faster and it was simpler. And this is exactly what we are doing, right? So my opinion is JSP was incredible fast. It was very good, but it was too much logic there. So as templating was okay, but the scriptlets are gone. And now I don't know whether you are aware, there's the MVC framework from Jakarta EE, This could have, with your framework, a small revival.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think Java has a huge. There's just a lot of technologies like the Spring community. I'm starting to see some flickers of adopting HTMX from the Spring community,
Hmm.
so I think there are obviously a bunch of really good templating languages and frameworks for Java, and there's no reason why Java can't be a best of breed language for producing hypermedia applications. Like I think
Hmm.
that's a goal. That's an explicit goal of mine is to like I'm coming back to Java and like, hey guys, we can
Yeah.
write Java code.
Then something happened. There is a Quarkus web framework
Yeah.
called Renard. You heard about
Okay.
that?
I have not heard of that one now.
This was released recently,
Okay.
and I think it will be highly compatible with HTML, HTMX,
Yep.
and Quarkus is interesting because you heard about Quarkus already? No,
I've not. It's
no,
no. I've heard of Quarkus. It's a async. It's async
no, no, no,
infrastructure,
no.
right? No.
This
No.
is
No. No.
crazy. So um, Micronaut and Quarkus are very similar approaches, and what
Okay.
they are doing. So you know Java E and J2E and
Yep.
Jakarta E and all the others EEs. So the difference is minor difference. APIs are the same. What's different is the application servers back then, Whitefly, WebSphere, and Payara and Glassfish or whatever.
Yep.
They loaded the war at runtime
Yeah.
and deployed the application at runtime. There was a thing called hot deployment. I don't know whether you remember, that you could load all the
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
application at, yeah.
Right.
What Quarkus and Micronaut are doing, they're doing the same at build time. So
Okay.
what it means is they are looking, at the application and they're reading all the deployment descriptors, whatever, and they're generating bytecode. So they look at the metadata, generate bytecode, highly efficient bytecode, so that the application consumes half of memory comparing to application servers or Spring even,
Mm.
and it starts very fast.
Okay.
So what we are doing right now, this is what I told you at the beginning, is we are using Quarkus actually in a serverless project with Lambda
Mm.
because it starts very fast and
Right.
it keeps going to be faster and faster because if the Lambda is hot, the JVM optimizes the bytecode and this is
Yep.
we get a very very fast performance. And
Sure.
this is why Quarkus takes off right now
Mm.
because it is the standard APIs, but it's very fast. And I don't know whether you are aware of GraalVM. You can
Yeah.
even you can even compile Quarkus natively, and
Yeah.
then it starts in milliseconds, and
Yep.
it only consumes a tenth of memory. So it will be very good for your machine actually.
Yeah.
So it is just 10% of the memory of compared to the application servers.
Yeah.
Sorry, to Quarkus on JVM.
Yep.
And what they released a framework called this Renard
Mm-hmm.
recently, which runs on this runtime. And this is like how they call it, old idea somehow modernized.
Mm-hmm.
And I would ping them because they're very open and it is just skyrockets. As I know, all major companies right now are using Quarkus. There's huge. I am. Last year in December, I had AWS workshop. There were lots of attendants all over the world and attendees from all over the world, and 60-70% were interested in Quarkus migration.
Yeah.
And why it is so popular? Because the companies would like to save money,
Mm-hmm.
by using Quarkus in order to make the cloud cheaper.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll have to take a look at it. It looks interesting for sure, and I'm super interested in Graal VM.
Mhm,
That's literally on the top of my to-do list just to take a look at that. So I want to
mhm,
do that for sure. But yeah, I mean, I think Java is well positioned to do a lot of it. I think there's going to be a Java resurgence in general. It's just such a good VM and it's a good enough programming language. And there's a lot of really good stuff coming out of Oracle at this point, and some of these open source research groups that they're funding. Um, can I really quickly, before we move on, though, I want to go back to something you said earlier. You talked about security, and you talked about
mhm.
how like user authentication is easier in a hypermedia infrastructure. And I want to make one point. I'm only making this because it just came up recently. I argue with people on the internet a lot. I probably shouldn't, but I do. And one of the arguments that I was recently in, or discussions, whatever you want to call it, was around GraphQL. So you, I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure, have heard of GraphQL.
Mm-hmm.
And GraphQL is kind of being held up as this, hey, here's our answer to this problem with API churn, right? So API churns all over the place. It's super annoying. The API engine, the backend engineers hate it. The front end engineers hate waiting for changes. So what we'll do is we'll give this query language to the front end developers to allow them to have a more expressive endpoint that they can do whatever they need to. Now they don't need to come to me to make an API change. Instead, they can just update their query. And so that's being pushed, and it's being pushed by Facebook as a solution to this API churn problem. The problem with that is that any increase in expressivity that you give to the front end developer, you're also giving to users, like to application users. They can always open up a console, figure out your code, figure out where the GraphQL query endpoints are, and start issuing queries against it. And so you have this tension where you want to give your front end developers a lot of expressive power, but you can't give them that much because of this security concern it's an untrusted computing environment. You're putting
Mm-hmm.
that power into the hands of not only your front end developers, but also anyone else who happens to be smart enough to fire up a console. And what I like to point out is that in a hypermedia application, that's not the case, because when you are generating hypermedia on the server side, you're actually in a trusted computing environment. And there your developers have full access to SQL or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
whatever query language they need to build their HTML, whatever joins they have to do, whatever crazy stuff they have to do to make their particular UI very fast. It's all right there and it's all available. And so you don't have that same security concern that you have in the case of front end development. So I'm a little bit of a GraphQL skeptic, so I just want to make that point because I think you're right on the nose that it is much easier to secure a hypermedia based application than it's much easier to make a mistake with a data driven API if you try to give too much expressive power to the front end. You just can't do that. So, and a lot of people, I have to say, I don't think understand that. I talk with them online and they're like, whatever. I'm just
Yeah.
like, well, man. All right.
What GraphQL is
All
for
right.
Java developers is like, I don't know whether you remember, there is Hibernate by example.
Mm-hmm.
So it was at the
Yep.
beginning that where you can, pre-fill an entity, send it back, and it just created query from this information and send it back.
Yep.
There's another disadvantage of GraphQL. You usually have to write the resolvers, right? So what you
Yeah.
have to do is a GraphQL endpoint, which is standardized, is called. But usually, what you don't have a GraphQL native database. There are some
Yeah.
open source native GraphQL databases, but usually you don't have them. So what you usually have are REST endpoints.
Yep.
So or your logic. So what you will have to do is you have to map, the inputs from the GraphQL query to your actual business logic, and this can be also challenging. I
Yeah.
would say because you have to map it twice. So we had a discussion, about layering, and this is exactly what happens.
Yep.
You have to map, the query to existing REST endpoints or direct to business logic, and
Yep.
this is underestimated, and this could be actually a sizable team which does nothing else than the GraphQL, queries,
Absolutely.
which is really complex.
Yeah.
Back to the versioning of the APIs,
Yeah.
a big deal. So in my Fed client approach, in all projects, there is always they try to version the URI V1.
Mm.
So they write,
Mm-hmm.
V1 in the URI. So my
Yep.
question is, what happens in V2? So how you find, the old clients, why that no one uses V1? So it's over.
Yep.
If you put to the outside world, the V1 once, it's over. So you
Yep.
have either, break the clients or you need a strategy. And what is the strategy? How many versions you would like to maintain? And even more interesting for Java developers, how the code looks like. It's like you are versioning packages. You have a package
Yep.
V1, V2, so you find that now having the same classes all over the place. Not that easy. And with the data APIs, so I think the only approach which works well is to be backwards compatible and have more testing, right? So this is
Yep.
the only survival strategy I think of. But this is also, in one point of time you will break the API. So this is also a
Yep.
downside. By the way, do you know Stefan Tilkov, a German?
I may. What does he work on?
Because you have to look him up. I would say, 5 to 10 years ago, he promoted in Europe, actually worldwide. He's I think CEO or CTO of InnoQ company,
Okay.
and he resource oriented architectures.
Mm.
So and this is absolutely what what you are explaining with HTMX. This
Mm-hmm.
was his idea as well.
Yeah.
Do this HTML right.
Yep.
I'm sorry, HTML hypertext right.
Yep.
Um, One question to
Yeah.
you: why you are so interested in promoting the framework?
Well, I think I see a lot of unnecessary complexity in the world.
Yeah,
And so I am in just, I'm older now, as the gray in my beard indicates.
yeah, it
And
looks like 25.
yeah, 25, exactly. Not a day older. But I've been through some startups. I've had some successful software companies.
Mhm.
And you get to a point where you kind of have to make a choice. Am I gonna be kind of a business guru? Am I gonna do the business thing, or am I gonna be a developer and just be an old developer? And so I've decided I'm gonna be an old developer. And one of the nice things about being an old developer is you've seen a lot. So I just feel like people don't appreciate the web, and darn it, they probably should. And so that's my motivation mainly. And another big motivator for me is I'm a programming languages person. So I, I teach the compilers class here. I have built a bunch of programming languages, and I particularly early on, like around 2015, I didn't like the fact that JavaScript was kind of rolling over the industry, and
Mhm.
everyone was just using JavaScript for everything. Once Node came along, it was like, well, why would we have a front end SPA written in JavaScript and then a back end written in some other language? Why not just use JavaScript on both sides and
Mhm.
now, reuse your logic and all that? And there's a terrible logic to that. But it's sure not good for diversity of languages. And I like a diversity of languages. I'm not a big Lisp guy, for example, but I'm glad Lisp exists. And I want Lisp people to be able to do web development on the same level as anyone else. And I
Mhm.
am a Java person, and I'd like to be able to do Java web development, without being handicapped by this, necessity of managing a large JavaScript code base as well for everything.
But
And
JavaScript is actually related to Lisp, right?
it is, yeah. It's got. I mean, there's the scoping and the closures
Yeah,
were
exactly.
Lisp like, but I mean, syntactically, it's not. It doesn't feel like Lisp to me. I don't know.
Okay, no, no, no.
Um,
But
so
you have no plans to have a company around HTMX, or sell support or whatever.
I've got Big Sky Software,
Mm-hmm.
which is my little consulting company, but
Mm-hmm.
it's BSD licensed. I'm not planning on making any
Okay.
money on it.
So how people can hire you on Big Sky Software, or what?
I think there's a contact there. I don't know. Let's look. Sky.software. Do I even have a I just sold my software company, and so I'm kind of, I gotta say, maybe not in the best spot as far as like accepting work right now.
Okay, so
Yeah, there's an
you need
email
you,
on Big
you need
Skies.
vacation. So right.
I mean, I guess I don't know. I always kind of stumble around and like stuff happens, and it's like, oh, okay, cool.
Okay.
So I'm not the best at running a business, but I've got a client that I'm working with right now that I really like, so it's all good. Um, but I am getting sponsored, I have to say, for HTMX, and a big sponsor that just announced a month and a little bit ago is JetBrains. So
Mm-hmm.
the IntelliJ folks. And they had a very generous. They have a very generous open source sponsorship
Mm-hmm.
program, and so they're sponsoring HTMX, which I think I'm very excited about because first of all, it's nice to get paid to work on your open source projects, but it's also really nice because I think it lends some credibility to the approach. The fact that
Mm-hmm.
JetBrains has said, okay, this is an approach we believe in, has really helped
Mm-hmm.
just get it some credibility. But to get back to my motivations, like, it's at this point, it's like I don't know. I kind of like joking around on the internet, and so it's fun to make fun of JavaScript. Just take it down a notch or two sometimes, and I do think that there's sort of a core network architecture of the web that has been lost, particularly among younger developers who all they know is React. They don't really know what hypermedia
Not
is.
even Angular, right?
Yeah, like they don't even know what Angular is.
Yeah.
They view HTML as this weird kind of janky UI description language that lives in the browser, and they have to deal with it because it's there. But they don't, they're just never exposed to
Yeah.
this
Everything is a
notion of
div, right,
hypermedia.
for
Yeah,
them.
everything's a div,
Yeah.
and I don't blame them. It's just the software industry hasn't done a great job of explaining the old stuff to new people. It's
Mm-hmm.
always like, what's the new stuff? And then you just go forward from there. You never think about
Okay.
what has come along previously.
So what I found is a consulting link, of course, on
Yeah.
HTMX, and this is HTMX at bigsky.software. So if
Yeah.
someone would like to interrupt your vacations, so feel free to ask for work.
Yeah.
And
If you really want to build a hypermedia, what I call a hypermedia driven application,
yeah,
you can give me a ring.
okay. And what as someone on Twitter said, okay, I have to invite you to the podcast because it's
Mm-hmm.
interesting. So I did it immediately, but I took a look at the HTMX.
Mm-hmm.
And my impression was completely different. What I thought is you are a very young developer who created something which is Ruby-like, Stimulus-like, and now
Yeah.
would like to start your own company around that. This was funny.
Nah.
So, and what I also did, I took a look at the source code of HTMX. So,
Yeah.
and what I liked about that, this is why I immediately invited you, is like it's like 3,700 lines of code of
Yep.
JavaScript code with Java JS doc, and it looks almost like Java. No, how you wrote it, it was
Yeah.
understandable for me. So it was like,
Yeah.
okay, I get it. So it just looks actually interesting. But this was all right. So is this everything, or I missed some dependencies?
No, HTMX is dependency free. It's just one file. I like the old school way, where you could just include a library in your
Yeah,
page and it just
perfect. So there are
worked.
no transpilations,
There's no
no
yeah,
builds.
no, none of that stuff. No, we're not doing any of that. And
This is also what I really don't like at all. The entire build system and all the stuff, I don't even get it. No,
yeah,
I just started with ES6 and web components. You are a backwards compatible. I saw you are using
yeah,
the older JavaScript, which I
yep,
don't like at all. What I really like is ES6. I try to
yep,
avoid completely everything which was before, prior
yeah.
to ES6.
Yeah, I write my code in ES5 and it is IE 11 compatible, believe it or not.
Hmm.
But what I found, and I think what you probably saw, is that I adopted a very Java-like way of structuring
Yeah,
my code. It's basically sort of functional Java, like
yeah,
because you don't have objects, fine. Like you can't create classes like you want to, whatever. You can in ES6, but in ES5 you can't. And so what I
hmm,
did instead was just say, okay, I'm going to write it basically as one big class that has a bunch of
exactly.
functions on it. And
Yeah,
then, it's funny because a lot of JavaScript developers look at my code and go, what is this? I can't make any sense of it. But then I find a lot of people who aren't JavaScript developers who take a look at it, they're like, oh, this is very civilized and easy to understand.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I really
So,
like that, and it is. No, I clicked on GitHub, so this is just for the listener. Just go to GitHub and click on your code,
yeah,
and for me it was. I mean, understandable. I couldn't get
yeah,
everything, but I look at
sure.
the functions. Okay, makes sense, and it looks like almost like Java, but
Yeah.
it was yeah.
Well, it's JavaScript being written by an old Java guy, so that probably makes some sense. There's some aspects of it that like you just can't avoid the junkiness of like the APIs that are available, but for the most part, it's pretty understandable.
Yeah,
And
prototype and stuff, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
but it is it's a BSD license, so it's very permissive. I'm not trying to trick anyone into using it. It's just I think it's a good way to
Yeah.
build software, and it's at this point I hope it's a community. It's a community tool that if someone is in Java and doesn't want to write a bunch of JavaScript, but does want better user experience, one thing we haven't talked about is what can you do with HTMX. So for example, one thing you can do with HTMX is you can implement infinite scroll. Now that's a controversial UX pattern, I get it. But with a few attributes, you could implement infinite scroll in a way that involves no JavaScript written by you, and that lets you implement that infinite scroll pattern almost entirely server side, just by generating HTML on the server with the right attributes on it. Similarly, another example of something you can do with HTMX with very little code or just HTML attributes is active search, where when you type into an input, the results automatically update. They automatically filter as you type. And so there are examples. If you go to htmx.org/examples, you can see a bunch of different examples of various patterns implemented with HTMX. And all of them, or in most of them, I should say, there's very little and typically zero client-side JavaScript that has been written. Instead, they're just attributes that are written on HTML elements, and then they delegate to the server side to generate the appropriate HTML. That ends up being a pretty effective way to build some fairly dynamic user interface elements.
Actually, I could put your attributes on custom elements.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I could actually have my web components and then use, your. This would be actually an interesting experiment.
Yeah, I know some people who have done it. I haven't gotten into that level of need. One thing I will say about HTMX and the hypermedia approach in general is it moves your factoring problem to the back end. So a lot of people who are super component oriented, they look at this and they say, well, how do I test all this? Where are my components? And the answer is, well, here you don't really have as many front end components necessarily, although it is, if you have true front end needs that don't interact with a server, that's a good ripe problem for a component in my mind in this model. But what you do is on the back end, you tend to factor your templates out. So if you have a bit of HTML that gets reused in like 3 or 4 places, you pull that out to a separate template. And so that's the factoring problem, right? That's where you're trying to take code that is being reused and move it into a central place.
What we could do, the combination with web components, there is it's called slots, and what you can have a web component, and usually I think it's called not in HTML but similar. So what I could do is I could use your framework, to fetch partial HTML, not the entire body, just the partial, and assign it to a web component, and then I have my components, because I could have the infinite scroll just within a web component, a custom element. And above, I could use your framework again to show something different, right? So this was still, like hypermedia with frames back then, right? So this could work, but there are no frames; it's just a web components, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And so HTMX is trying to increase the expressivity of HTML, and in as much as you're working in HTML, you should be able to use it for whatever you want.
Because we used a web components, for instance, to encapsulate a framework, JavaScript framework. So we could integrate a framework just by using web component. And what I can do in your case, there is no framework, just HTML, even better, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because I'm using inside the web component, I'm using lit HTML to generate HTML.
Okay. Yeah.
And what I could do is, of course, I could use your HTMX to pull the HTML markup from the backend, but would be actually similar markup in the front end, complete different architecture, but interesting. Is worth exploring, actually.
Yeah, it sounds like it. So again, and I one shortcoming of HTMX is that because it's trying to improve HTML as a hypermedia, there's no preferred backend. So there's no backend that is going to be better at producing HTML. I mean, there are some that are better than others, but it levels the playing field pretty significantly. But that also makes it hard to give demos because, I have Python developers and Lisp developers, Haskell developers, Java developers all come to me and they say, well, how do I make this work? And it's like, well, here are the tools and here's the basic pattern. Here's an example, but the code, the server side code, unfortunately is written in JavaScript because that's what's available. Because I mock it out all client side, but so it ends up being, I think, a little bit more work than it would be if it were more tightly integrated. So this, like you mentioned Java server faces, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's an example where there's a really tight integration between a back end and a front end. TurboLinks, I think, has some of this. TurboLinks not as bad, but TurboLinks kind of starts tiptoeing that direction too. And where there's a really tight integration between back end and front end. And you can do a lot of very interesting stuff with this. A great example is LiveView. So LiveView in the PHP community is this really super dynamic way to figure out exactly what gets updated. Very interesting. HTMX is not that. HTMX is basically just trying to take HTML and level it up a little bit. So give you more functionality out of the box. And that makes it more back-end agnostic. Anybody can use it against any framework, but it also means that when you have work to do, when you have something that you need updated, like you've got to do the work. So just, again, that's one of those design trade-offs I just want to make people aware of when they compare and contrast it with other libraries out there.
Yeah, what I will have to say, what makes it interesting, right? So it's a completely different approach, which is nice.
Yeah.
Okay, where people can find you? So on the internet. So Big Sky Software, you already said.
Yeah,
Twitter?
bigsky.software. htmx.org is also, that's the main open source website. On Twitter, there's htmx_org. That's the Twitter account that I run. I tend to joke around quite a bit on that one, so don't take it too seriously. I don't take things very seriously, so if you're a very serious person, I apologize in advance. But you're going to see some jokes. That's pretty much it.
Do you have a personal Twitter account or no?
I don't. I spend too much time on Twitter as it is.
Okay.
But there's also, if you go to htmx.org/discord, that will redirect you to our Discord server for HTMX. And I know that's problematic. Not everyone likes Discord, but that's just what we use right now.
Discord is nice.
Chat. Yeah, there's good and bad aspects of it, but we have a pretty active Discord and pretty friendly. And so if you don't struggle with HTMX, if you're having issues, just jump on the Discord. And there's a lot of really smart people on it. They can help out pretty quick. Unfortunately, like Stack Overflow isn't very heavily populated at this point with HTMX articles or with HTMX questions. And part of that is that HTMX is so simple. It doesn't generate the number of questions that some of these other libraries generate, but so that's basically where I am, the HTMX community is again, I hope still pretty friendly. I'm sure we'll become embittered at some point, but at this point we're not. So take advantage of us while we're friendly.
So it was really nice to meet you. So interesting discussion, and I will try it. So it looks interesting. And what I like, one file, no transpilations, and back to the roots.
Yep, no dependencies, and it's the original. It's the way the web was designed. This is the way the web was supposed to be. So,
thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Adam, for having me on.